Well, we'll start from my kindergarten. I think that was one of the best situations. We had the schools weren't integrated back then, so my first teacher was the best teacher I've had all my life. Her name was Mosella Morris Vaughn, and she taught kindergarten, first and second grade. She introduced us to so much. She read Aesop fables to us. Coming into school in the morning, she made you stand in line. She expect behind your ear. She taught hygiene and everything. On that potbelly stove in her classroom, she made lunches for kids way before we had any indication about how important lunches were for kids from different backgrounds. Well, we had a pretty nice school. It was all brick, and we had a gymnasium. Basketball was big there. The town was the county seat, so it was the only high school for quite a distance. Kids had to come and board there just to go to high school from a whole lot of surrounding communities. So we really had the best of a bad situation there. Yeah, in sports, once I got into high school, basketball was king. We played fast pitch softball, and one of our instructors, we didn't have tennis, but he painted a tennis court on the basketball court, taught us tennis, so we was able to buy our own rackets and get interested in that. But before that, growing up, I was a dynamite marble shooter. I didn't play for fun, I played for keeps, and I enjoyed shooting marbles. Growing up in a community like that, most of my playmates were farmers, and my parents didn't farm, so I had a whole lot of time to myself. Most of the kids wouldn't even get to school until late because they had to work on their farms when school started. So it was a kind of lonely time for a kid. We had 70% of the kids would get to school late back in those days. Well, in school, it was fun, but out of school, you didn't have anyone to play with because all the kids were working. My dad worked on the railroad. My mother, she was a cook and a seamstress, and so we didn't come in contact with any whites because most of the area was a farming area, and either you farmed. The only jobs for blacks back then was the railroad or teaching school. When I graduated from high school in '53, the schools were still segregated, and to see what happened with Eisenhower in Little Rock when they integrated the schools there, I lived through that because I graduated from high school before they integrated the schools. It just was life, that's what it was. Like I say, if you had known something different, maybe it had been rough, but that's all you had known. I had two sisters and a brother, but we had a different father. My two sisters, one was 11 years older than me, one was 13 years older than me, and one brother, he was 9 years older than me. So I kind of grew up by myself, and conditions for me, seemingly, what I've been told by them, were much better than theirs because I had a dad and they were raised by mom by herself. Well, we were much better off than most because, like I say, my dad worked on the railroad, plus he had a barbecue stand, which was, we'd barbecue a pork shoulder on Friday, and on a Saturday, we had a stand that we'd put up in the town. I guess I was about 8 years old, and we had a stand with a counter, and we would sell the pork shoulder sandwiches for 35 cents a piece until we made enough money to buy ribs. And we'd buy about 6 slabs of ribs, and we'd barbecue the ribs on the scene, right in town. And it was the county seat, and it was the largest little community in the surroundings, so it would be people there from 10 o'clock in the morning to 10 o'clock at night. I remember most people heated their homes with wood, and you would go into the woods, cut down a tree, cut the wood up, stack it in piles on the weekend when the people weren't using their farm animals. You would get their wagons and mules, go and pick up your wood and bring it, but you had to give the man half of what you had cut for using his mules and wagon. And I would notice years later, I'd be hunting and see where a person that maybe died or got sick and the wood they had stacked up would rot down. No one would go and steal their wood that they had cut out there. I thought that was just great. We're talking about a time when you didn't have electricity. You had kerosene lamps, and your heating was from the wood I just mentioned, and your cook stove was cooked with wood. So you didn't have any bills for light, gas, or water because you had a pump that you either later years, one of your neighbors might have had running water, and you had a pump that you would use for your regular work around the house, but for your drinking water, you'd go to a neighbor and get buckets of water to drink with. And we never had a house note. I'm thankful for that. When my dad had one of the first houses with running water in Marion, and he divorced and married my mother, and she had a house. So we never had to pay rent all my life, so I never knew what that was like. And in fact, I still own the house. So I've always had jobs, and it's been so important in my life. I picked cotton before I was 10 years old, and I always liked to dress well, even at 10 years old. My first pair of tailor-made pants, what they called drapes back then, I made the money, and it cost $16 for a pair of drapes to be tailor-made by Lewis Letters on Main Street in Memphis. And after that, I'm in high school, but I washed cars and pumped gas at a service station on a Saturday. After that, I racked balls in a pool hall, and with that you had the shoe shine stand, so I was able to shine shoes when I wasn't racking balls. So I made more money shining shoes than I did racking the balls. I got $5 for that day, and I had to clean the pool hall on Friday evening and Saturday night after the place closed. After that, I worked in Memphis after school was out. I got a job at Lloyd's Shoe Store, and that was $25 a week, which I'm talking about now in 1951 and 50. And I worked there during the summer. The following summer, I worked at Rhodes Jennings Furniture Company long enough to make my fare to Chicago. My both sisters lived in Chicago, so when school was out in the last of May, I went to Chicago and stayed with them and got a job washing dishes at Toffanetti Restaurant, making $45 a week with meals. I thought I was going to get rich. So I worked there, and we had a split session in schools where you would be out of school July and August to chop cotton. So I didn't come back and go to school in my hometown July and August. So I stayed and worked through until September. And I went to school in West Memphis, 5 miles south of Marion, to make up those 2 months. And then I graduated in 1953. After that, I worked at Rhodes Jennings Furniture Company long enough to get my fare to Chicago, worked there 2 weeks, and then I came back to Chicago, got my old job back at Toffanetti washing dishes. Only had to work there a couple of weeks because I got a job at Barrett Roofing Company where they made roofing for houses. There I made about $75 a week, so that was a step up for me. I worked there until November. The roofing place laid me off in November. I came back down home with my parents, hunted and fished the winter, and went back to Chicago in the spring, about the 1st of March. And I went back, they called me back to the roofing company, but I only had to work there a couple of weeks before I was called to the post office as a mail handler. Best job I ever had, hated it worse than anything I can remember. And I was working next to clerks, which made more than a mail handler, plus it was a cleaner job. I flunked the clerk carrier's exam, and so I worked as a mail handler for 2 years before I passed the clerk carrier exam. So I got into those word power books and that 6th grade math, and I passed the clerk carrier's exam in '56. And luckily, I was able to go to Midway Airport and work as a railway mail clerk. You had the option there to work at Midway, working airmail off the planes, or either work mail on trains or RPOs. So I worked there until they closed Midway down in 1962. I didn't own a car. We never did have a car. So I elected to go on the road and work mail on the trains because I didn't have any transportation to get from Chicago to O'Hara, where they built a new airport. Working at Midway was one of the best things ever happened to me because there I was around a whole lots of adults that were really overeducated. Some of them were doctors, some were lawyers, and they were there just because they were black, but it was a fabulous surrounding for me because I was introduced to people with backgrounds that really shouldn't have been in the post office. My dad, I don't know anything about his people. My dad left home when he was about 10 years old, and he stayed with some whites took him in, and he stayed with some white people until he was 11. They had a kid about the same age as he, and once they started getting into it, he was on his own from then on. So that's one reason I believe he was able to train me to be so independent at such a young age, because he had done it himself. And my mother worked at a hotel where she got off at 10 o'clock at night. And we lived in the country, there was no street lights. But with a lantern, I'd go and pick up my mother. And when I got to the hotel door, it just had a half a glass door. And when I'd knock on the door, they'd know it was me because they couldn't see anyone over that glass door. But he taught me to never fear anything. And at 10 years old, I could go and get my mother, go any place else at night. I had rain paraphernalia, whatever I had, nothing stopped me. And my dad was a heck of a provider. I remember we raised chickens, and we'd get those one-day-old chickens through the mail, and they'd send you about 107. But we had such a good situation for raising the chickens. We'd raise over 100 out of that 107, and they never touched the ground until they were frying size. We had brooders we made and bought, and like I say, he worked for the railroad for all of those years, and he always had a barbecue stand. So it's just the background. And like you mentioned that I have sisters. Yeah, I had 2 sisters. And to show you how independent, they called it fixing hair back then. But they both were beauticians when they were in high school. And my brother, the only job he ever had was a presser and spotter and dyer in a cleaners. He worked at a cleaners all his life through high school and adulthood. My mother's people, I don't know where they came from, but none of them ever worked on a farm. She had about 4 brothers, a sister, her nieces. They all cooked for private homes. My uncle, he had a pressing shop there in Arkansas. He moved to Memphis, and then he moved to New York. He was a chef on trains, and he was a chef in large hotels in Kansas City, New York City, where he lived. But with her family, to live in a community where everything was farming but railroad or teaching school, and none of them to work on a farm, have always been puzzling to me. I was a mail carrier for 14 and a half years, counting that 2 years that I told you about that I hated that mail handler. I worked the mail on the trains, first trains I worked on after Midway Airport closed down. I worked from Chicago to Peoria on a little turnaround. You'd work Thursday, Friday, Saturday, off Sunday. Then you'd work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and you was off 6 days. Your neighbors didn't think you had a job. After I got enough seniority to transfer from the Rock Island running into Peoria, I transferred to the Chicago and Memphis because my parents lived in Memphis, so I wanted to run on the road from Chicago to Memphis. Although I didn't have enough seniority at first, I only had to run from Chicago to Carbondale for a few years. After that, I was able to run from Chicago to Memphis while both my parents were living, and I worked 4 on and 8 days off. And during that 8 days off, I worked at a mail order house to just make some extra money. But I always worked, and I worked there, like I say, for 14 and a half years. The reason I left the post office, I hadn't been able to save up any money. We were renting, and I got married in '58, and I left the post office in '69 and went to Chicago Transit Authority. There I drove a bus for the company. I drove a bus for 8 years, and I went into supervision for 17 years. While driving the bus for CTA, I'd get up mornings and had a part-time job picking up handicapped kids. I'd pick them up, take them to school, take them back, and then about 5:30 I'd go to work for Chicago Transit Authority and get off about 3 o'clock in the morning. I'd done that for about 8 years, and then I got a part-time job cashing checks for fill-ins. So I cashed checks for fill-ins for 8 years after driving that part-time bus, all the time with the Chicago Transit Authority. So I was a bus driver for 8 years, supervision for 17. So I retired in 1994, 25 years, and I was 59 years old. Like I say, I was running on the road, so I was on the road quite often. When I finished up my run to Memphis, I had to deadhead back to Chicago. So I was on the train left about 2 o'clock in the evening, and I saw my wife, didn't know her. She and her grandmother was a little late getting to the train. So I got off the train to help them on, and needless to say, after that, I went back and offered them drinks and got the address and was able to get in touch with her once they got to Chicago, because she stayed in Chicago for that summer. She moved back she was only here to visit. She was back in Memphis. So I was down home visiting some friends and went to the fair there and was lucky enough to run into my wife at the fair. And so I got her address again. This is a year and a half later. And she said she was coming back to Chicago. So I got her address and gave her my phone number, so we was able to reconnect again. And so I went together about a year before we got married in 1958. I was 22 and a half, she was 18 and a half. And we've been married 54 years. We got 3 kids. My oldest daughter, Cheryl. I got a boy in the middle, Kenneth. They're all about 4.5 years apart. I never had 2 in college at the same time. All 3 of them have at least a master's degree. My wife, she hadn't finished school when we got married. She went back to school, got her education, got her a master's degree. So we're proud of what the kids have done for themselves. Each one of the kids work for themselves. They have a business of their own. So from Marion, Arkansas to Chicago, we love Chicago. We love Illinois. All of my kids went to school in Illinois. I remember getting in trouble when I guess I might have been 14, maybe a little younger, but we were stealing watermelons. Kid's name was Ben Tate. And just show you how a small town is, one of our neighbors, John Harris, was painting a building, and he saw us moving into this man's, and he came down to my dad's house that evening and told Dad what we were doing. And man, I got the worst whipping I ever got in my life for stealing. And told me that they would be caught with that war again. It was less than 6 months before that kid was in the reform school. And I always thought about how neighbors would really lean out and really help with the education and straightening out kids. In fact, if a neighbor came and told your parents you'd done something wrong, that was all had to be said. That wasn't questioned. It was appreciated. I retired in '94, so I've been around my grandkids. My oldest daughter, she lived in California, and then she moved back to Illinois, so I wasn't around her two daughters that much. But with my son, his kids, he lived in Illinois, so I was around their kids, his kids. He got 5 kids. He got 2 daughters now at home, a son in college, and the other 2 are grown. So my youngest daughter, we've lived together, or close together, ever since I retired. So her kids, I was as close to them as they were my kids with them growing up. I'm the cook, and so I do the cooking, the sandwich making, and the picking them up and what have you, and I spoil them to death.
Tell me, when did you learn to cook?
My mother was a great cook. My dad was a great cook. My uncle, I mentioned, he was a professional cook.
I mean, when you first heard that Barack Obama was president, I mean, what did you think?
When luckily Obama spoke at my oldest granddaughter's graduation in New Orleans there. So I had met him, that's the first time I'd seen him, but I never dreamed I would live to see a serious run for president by a black person. And with his background, his understanding of the history of this country, where he was brought up and the studies he had, I can't picture a better person for the job. I don't believe a person without his background would have been able to pull off what he pulled off. When I wasn't allowed to vote, there were so many things you wasn't allowed to do. Like I mentioned, the thing that affected me most was the segregated schools, the movies you went to, they were segregated. You didn't come in contact with hardly any whites when you were a young kid like me because everything was segregated. Water fountains were black and white. Restaurants, you couldn't eat in most restaurants. If you did, you had to go in the back. I remember in Peoria, Illinois on July 4th, it was a 3-man route. My boss, another clerk, and myself on the train. And we went downtown. I'd usually bring my lunch with me, but that day I didn't. So we went downtown in Peoria, and we sat down at a restaurant to eat. And like I say, this was '62. And the lady told me I was the only black, the other two were white. She said, I'm sorry, but you'll have to go behind that curtain there for me to serve you. And being from the South and had known that all my life, moving to Chicago, I thought that was behind me. But it wasn't that way. In some restaurants, even in Chicago, you would sit there and wait to be waited on, and you'd notice the people would pass you by, serve you, bring you part of your dinner, bread might be late. So it was a humiliating thing that you had to go through, and thankfully things have changed a lot. Education, 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 and work, your work ethics, when you go about it. I would have gone to college, but I didn't believe, I thought I could, which I did. At the time, I didn't feel like anybody would outwork me. I felt like I'd outwork anybody, and which I did. But now, looking back, the jobs I had, I was able to make a good living for myself and my family. They're not there anymore. Every job I mentioned to you, even the post office, that's not, you don't have the future there that I had. I never worried about being laid off. We never had a strike. When I left the post office, I talked to people that I was looking for a job. I was looking for a job because I wanted my retirement money down to pay down on a house and get myself started. So I inquired about the gas company, the police department, and one of my friends, Alvin Long, told me he knew of people that worked for Chicago Transit Authority during the Depression, took care of 2 and 3 families. They never laid off, they never struck. So that was, I was interested, and that's where I went. And luckily, after 14 and a half years with the post office, I got a raise by going to the with the transportation company. And why I didn't go to the gas company or the telephone company, I wasn't able to take that starting salary. I would, well, you asked me about, so I want to talk about the positive things that with black and white. I remember my dad had a friend there. My dad would be in the hospital sometime for months at a time. He was a veteran from World War I. And he only took up things on credit from one store. The man's name was Wright. And I remember when my dad would be in the hospital for a good length of time, my mother wouldn't send me up there to buy anything on credit. He came down to my mother's house one Saturday from his store and say, Minnie, I noticed you haven't sent the boy up to get anything while George is in the hospital, but you send him up for anything you want. And if George get out of the hospital, the 2 of us will handle it. If you don't get out of the hospital, you don't owe me nothing. Those are the kind of friends. And we had another one. They had a service station that I mentioned that I worked at when I got older. I guess I was about 12 or 14. And he and his wife took me fishing. I'd never been fishing in a boat for crappie fishing. She didn't have much use for me. She'd always call me boy in the nastiest way. But I remember that day, I was in the middle of the boat. He was on one end and she was on the other end. We were crappie fishing. And I caught about 4 crappies, my first time ever crappie fishing, and I dropped a couple back. But boy, she would catch my pole and rebait it up so quick. But after that one encounter, she never called me boy again. She always called me by my name. And her husband was always friendly to my dad. In fact, my dad done a whole lot of barbecuing for large churches and affairs and for his daughter's wedding. I remember one of the largest barbecuing my dad ever done, where he had to start barbecuing about 4 o'clock in the evening, barbecued all night for the wedding that was going to be at 6 o'clock the next evening. But when it came to that barbecuing, no one could barbecue with my dad. Giving. My parents, they both were giving people. I remember we didn't have TVs and people would come by to bring you the local gossip. And my dad was told of an individual that was very sick and didn't have the hospitalization or the money for his sickness. My dad went around to every family in our little community, took up money and gave it to him. The man was able to get the medical attention that he needed. In fact, he outlived my dad. But one thing about it, once my dad done it, I never heard him mention it again in his life. And the same thing about the public schools. The white kids had slides, merry-go-rounds, and playground equipment. My dad said, well, we should get it for ourselves. He went to every family, white and black in the community, and took up the money. My dad couldn't read and write, so I had to go with him to write down with the shoebox and a tablet what each person gave. We was able to get a swing with three swings, a slide, a merry-go-round, and a seesaw. My dad never mentioned doing that again in his life. After my parents passed, I've gotten some literature from the church where they bought a steam table for the church that my mother was with. So they were giving people, and I think nothing in life is more important than giving. We're always able to give, whether it's just with a smile or whatever, but look forward to doing as much as you can for somebody, and doing it because you want to do it, doing it because it's right, not because of to put somebody in an obligating situation.